47 kilometers north of Rome, in a small Italian village, a celebration was held each year on January 1st. This event, called the Feast of the Circumcision of Our Lord, displayed the preserved foreskin of Jesus as it was paraded through town in a small gold and glass case that was encrusted with precious gemstones. This relic joined about a dozen other holy foreskins that existed in Europe over the centuries, attracting visitors and donations. Like all relics, it was said to possess magical powers and might heal those who attended its presentation. And like those others, it was eventually lost. It was last seen during its annual parade in 1983. After that, it vanished, or was stolen. Though, according to the 17th century theologian Leo Elacius, the holy foreskin ascended into the heavens along with Jesus and became the rings of Saturn. I'm your host Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. We pick up our study of 2 Kings and the story of Elisha in chapter 9. Elisha decides it's time to cast out the descendants of Ahab from Israel, thus avenging those prophets killed by Jezebel. So he sends one of his disciples to anoint Jehu, the captain of the chariots. The plan is to anoint him in secret. We saw something similar with the hurried coronation of Solomon. The thinking is simple. Once a priest says that you're king, how can anyone else disagree? That's the thought process of the authors, at least. In reality, things would have been a bit different. This is just their way of supplanting the authority of the king with the authority of the priest. Another indication this material comes from the post-exilic period, when the Israelites no longer had a king. There's a prophecy that Jehu would destroy the house of Ahab and Jezebel would be devoured by dogs and no one would bury her. Because this is the book of Kings and bad people get eaten by wild animals and no one gets buried if they ever displeased Yahweh. Jehu's military officers accepted him as the new king and became part of the conspiracy against King Joram, who was still recovering from a previous battle against the Arameans. As they approached the city of Jezreel, horsemen were sent out to check on the approaching riders. Jehu commanded them to fall in behind him, so they did. King Joram, king of Israel, and King Ahaziah of Judah rode out to meet him. Joram asked if all was well, and Jehu replied, "How can all be well as long as your mother Jezebel carries on her countless harlotries and sorceries?" Which is exactly what I say to my girlfriend whenever I return home. Realizing his peril, King Joram turned to flee, but Jehu shot him in the back and killed him. King Ahaziah likewise fled and was likewise shot in the back, though he did make it all the way to Megiddo before dying of his injuries. His servants carried his body back to Jerusalem to be buried. As for Joram, his corpse was tossed into a field to satisfy Yahweh's desire for revenge after the wrongful death of Naboth at the hands of Jezebel. As a reminder, Naboth was the man who owned the vineyard that Ahab coveted. When the man refused to sell it to Ahab, Jezebel had him killed, and there was a prophecy of impending retribution for his crime. So the son must pay for the crimes of the mother. After this happened, Jehu went to the city and called up to the eunuchs who were with Jezebel, and told them to toss her out of the window. I guess she wasn't a favorite among the staff in the palace, because without hesitation, they threw her out and she splattered on the ground below, and was then trampled by horses. Jehu instructed a group of people to bury her because she was a king's daughter and deserved a proper burial. But we're also told that her hands, feet, and head were all devoured by dogs in accordance with the prophecy, so we have a few contradictions to deal with. It seems that this was originally a story about a military coup, with Jehu gathering his soldiers and ambushing the king in order to take the throne. Jezebel was also killed and buried. Then the redactors got their hands on the story and added the theological details, like Jezebel being an enemy of Yahweh and the prophecy of her being eaten by dogs. Jehu achieved his throne not by conquest, but simply by being named king by a prophet, and Jezebel was then eaten by wild animals. I'm not saying this is exactly how it happened, that the story can be separated so neatly into two distinct layers, but the idea makes a certain amount of sense and explains the contradictions found within the text. In chapter 10, Jehu sends letters to the 70 descendants of Ahab, instructing them to send their best to fight him. This is the sort of thing that happens in the Homeric epics. They replied that they would be loyal to Jehu, so there was no need for violence. Not satisfied with this, Jehu demanded the heads of Ahab's sons. Wishing to escape such a grim fate for themselves, the rest of Ahab's descendants beheaded Ahab's male children and sent them in a basket to Jehu as proof of their loyalty. But this didn't save them. After piling the heads outside the city gates, he had the rest of Ahab's family put to death, including other relatives and even friends. He even gathered up all of his priests and executed them as well, just as Yahweh had said through Elisha. On the road, Jehu met 42 kinsmen of the recently deceased King Ahaziah, so he promptly had them captured and also executed. He then met with Jehonadab the Reshabite and invited him along so the Reshabite could see for himself Jehu's zeal for Yahweh. He entered Samaria and murdered all the survivors of Ahab's house, women and children included, to fulfill Yahweh's word. Finally, he pronounced to all the people of the city that he would hold a great sacrifice to Baal and needed all of his priests in attendance. So all the priests and all the worshippers of Baal in this city fell for the trick and filed neatly into the temple of Baal. How they couldn't sense the trap is beyond me, since the man advertising the event was on a murderous rampage that already included the priests of Baal, and was determined to eradicate anyone even remotely connected with his predecessor or his form of worship. But they all entered the temple anyway, and Jehu's guards murdered everyone. The temple was torn down, the sacred pillars burned, and the location became a latrine pit. There are a couple of details to cover before moving on. First, there's the Reshabite that Jehu was attempting to impress. Reshabites were a post-Babylonian group who practiced a puritanical form of their religion, holding to a stricter code of behavior and completely abstaining from alcohol. So murdering all who disagreed with them would certainly elevate someone in their eyes. Then there's the murder of all the priests of Baal. This killing of priests parallels Elijah's killing of Baal's prophets in 1 Kings 18. And we have to wonder where this crowd of priests came from after Elijah had already murdered them all. Perhaps they're like the Egyptian livestock in the Exodus story that Yahweh killed on 4 separate occasions. At this point, we're told that Jehu did not destroy the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. Remember from the episode on 1 Kings that the golden calf was an idol to Yahweh, but Yahweh no longer liked this depiction. So the God tells Jehu that because he murdered all of the men, women, and children of Ahab's house, he would get 4 more generations on the throne. But for failing to destroy the metal cows, he would have Hazael attack them. We mentioned Hazael in the last episode. He was the new Aramean king that was put in power by Yahweh in order to punish the Israelites for this crime right here, which hadn't yet been committed. In true Book of Kings fashion, we're told that we can find the rest of the information about King Jehu in the source material entitled The Annals of the Kings of Israel. He reigned 28 years and was buried in Samaria and succeeded by his son Jehoaz. After Jehu killed King Ahaziah of Judah, Ahaziah's mother Athaliah went on her own murder spree and killed off all of her grandsons so that she could rule over Judah. But Ahaziah's sister took Joash and hid him away to spare his life. 7 years later, the priest Jehoiada introduced Joash to the guards and made them promise to protect him so that he could become their new king. Why he suddenly needed protection is unclear, as the entire nation was convinced he had died a half-dozen years earlier. But the guards are armed with King David's spears, and Joash is anointed by the priest as the new king. Again, we have the idea that the title of king is given by the priest. And this mention of the king's guards brandishing spears which once belonged to King David is possibly a reference to ceremonial spears that the guards actually carried, which were given some kind of legendary status. So the guards are watching as Jehoiada anoints and crowns Joash as the new king. And what do they all do? While trying to maintain secrecy, they all shout, "Long live the king," at the top of their lungs and alert the tyrant queen to the treason. Not very smart if you're trying to be secretive. But Jehoiada had the guards on his side, so he ordered them to capture the queen and escort her outside the temple to be executed. Then Jehoiada reinforced the covenant between Yahweh, the king, and the people. This is another of those references to the ancient idea that the king was your connection to the patron deity of your nation. This is still alive today as people hold to the words of Jesus found in John 14:6, where their king states, "No one comes to the Father except through me." Now that the people had an established connection with Yahweh, they all marched on the temple of Baal and destroyed it, smashing the altars and images and murdered the priest. The guards escorted Joash to the palace where he ascended to the throne. He was young at the time, having been spared as a child from the slaughter of his deranged grandmother, like Moses or Laura Dannon from Willow. We are told in the beginning of chapter 12 that he reigned in Jerusalem for 40 years and did what was pleasing to Yahweh all of his life, meaning he didn't set up shrines or commit idolatry as those filthy northern kings had done. But then we're told in the very next verse that he kept those shrines open and the people continue worshiping and making sacrifices there. So he's committing the same offenses that displease Yahweh in the northern kingdom. So why does he get a pass? There are a couple of things going on here that we need to understand. First, by throwing shade on the other temples and shrines outside of Jerusalem, the author is arguing for centralized worship within the Jerusalem temple. This is anachronistic, as the practice of centralizing worship didn't begin until refugees from the northern kingdom of Israel began flooding into Judah following the Assyrian conquest. Once that occurred, the rulers of Jerusalem found it difficult to maintain control over the sparsely populated hill country, became home to thousands of new residents. So they began dismantling hilltop shrines in an attempt to force these outlying communities to concentrate worship in Jerusalem. The second point to consider is that the author of this tale is himself from Jerusalem and has a dim view of the northern kingdom. So while Joash may allow shrines on the periphery to remain open, just as the northern kings had done, the act isn't seen to be as terrible. Remember, the authors wish to portray their former rulers in a positive light. But they still have to show that the monarchy wasn't the correct form of government. They're writing from a time period in which they were ruled by priests and governors who obeyed the Persian emperor, not a Jewish king. Joash sets the priests to the task of repairing the temple. They're to use the donations to hire workers for the job, but during his 23rd year, he discovers they haven't made the repairs. So he revoked their control over the donations and placed the royal scribe in charge of the money. From there, it would be paid to the carpenters directly, but the money made for guilt and sin offerings still went to the priest. Apparently, giving large amounts of money to the clergy has always been problematic. But this scene is really here to set up for something in chapter 22 during the life of King Josiah. Then we're told that King Hazael of Aram marched on Jerusalem. Joash's good standing with Yahweh didn't help him much, and he was forced to strip the temple of all the consecrated objects of value and give them to Hazael as a tribute to avoid destruction. Some years later, he was assassinated by a group of conspirators within his own court and succeeded by his son Amaziah. Going back up north to Israel, Jehu's son Jehoaz became king for 17 years, and of course he displeased Yahweh, who repeatedly delivered the Israelites into the hands of King Hazael of Aram. Jehoaz begged Yahweh for help because of the suffering of the Israelite people, and Yahweh felt sorry for them and regretted his actions. So Yahweh is admitting that what he did was wrong. So he delivered the Israelites from the Arameans, but they didn't turn from their worship involving idols and sacred posts which stood in Samaria. The same idols and sacred posts that were just destroyed by Jehu in chapter 10. After the destruction from the Arameans, Israel was left with only 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 footmen. And that's all we have concerning his time as a king. His son Joash succeeded him and ruled for 16 years, which is a bit odd because we now have two kings with the same name ruling over both northern and southern kingdoms at the exact same time, which makes me wonder if there was some confusion when the authors were writing out their list of kings. All we're told about this king is that he was in conflict with Judah, and other details are recorded in the annals of the kings of Israel. He was then succeeded by Jeroboam. In 2 Kings 13:14, we abruptly return to Elisha to find him gravely ill and anticipating his death. King Joash went to him and cried, "Father, Father, Israel's chariots and horsemen." This is a reference to Elisha being seen as a defender of the nation, with his miracles where he summoned the chariots and cavalry of heaven to drive out the Arameans that we saw in 2 Kings 6-8. Elisha asked for a bow and arrow to be brought to him. When it was delivered, he fired an arrow through the eastern window and claimed that there would be victory over Aram at the city of Aphek. He then told the king to pick up the arrows and strike the ground. King Joash did so and struck the ground 3 times, which angered Elisha because he secretly wanted the king to strike the ground 5 or 6 times, which would have meant the annihilation of the Arameans. But since the king only struck the ground thrice, they would only defeat the Arameans 3 times. Perhaps he could have said something about this before giving the order. But since he's the mouthpiece of Yahweh, we shouldn't expect communication to be his strong suit. These 2 prophecies, that they would smite the Arameans at Aphek, and that they would be victorious in 3 battles but not completely destroy the Arameans, account for the 12th and 13th miracles of Elisha. Only one more to get to an even 14 and perfectly double the score of his predecessor. But then Elisha died. At the end of chapter 13, a couple of guys are digging the grave for Elisha, and this scene is a bit contrived. He's the most well-known prophet in Israel, so popular that people from other lands, including the Arameans, come to seek his miraculous powers, yet he's being buried in what appears to be a mass grave. No grand funeral, no burying him in any place of importance, like beneath a terebinth tree or something. Nope. Not for the most miraculous man in the kingdom. He's being buried by a couple of anonymous guys in the countryside, along with several other stiffs. They have several bodies to dispose of, and Elisha is among them. Why? Because they need to set up for that 14th miracle, so that he can perfectly double the amount of miracles of his predecessor Elijah. If they buried him inside Samaria in his own tomb, they wouldn't be able to work this scene into the story. So, with no explanation, he's being buried as a beggar. They're digging the hole and unceremoniously toss his corpse in. Then the Moabites, who invade the land every year, come charging in, which causes the gravediggers to drop the next body out of fear right on top of Elisha. As soon as the corpse makes contact, the dead man springs to life and exits the grave. This is an etiological tale to explain the origins of a healing shrine at this location. The bodies of magic men were believed to contain power even after their death, so visiting their graves or possessing a piece of their flesh or bone was thought to be a conduit to that power. These holy sites and relics were often believed to possess healing capabilities. To convey this idea, we get stories such as this, which show that the prophet could not only bring people back from the dead, as he had with the Shunammite boy in 2 Kings chapter 14, but he could even accomplish the feat after his own death. Now that is some true power. And the author of Matthew's Gospel would recycle this concept for Jesus when his death prompted the resurrection of saints in Jerusalem in chapter 27, verse 53 of that story. To this day, there are people who believe that the bones of saints can heal injuries and cure diseases, which has led to a booming relic trade. Many of these gruesome tokens, often slivers of bone, are simply removed from random graves and catacombs and then sold off as being authentic fragments of some random person's body. One such instance of this is the Holy Prepuce, the foreskin of Jesus. This first appeared during the Middle Ages, and at one time there were over a dozen foreskins making their rounds in Europe, all purported to have come from Christ. As far as I can tell, none of Jesus' dozen or so foreskins are still around today, though countless bones purporting to have come from saints, many of which never actually existed, are still in circulation. And I've personally seen some of these when I was still a Catholic. Also, this idea that miracles can be performed by someone following their death has become part of the criteria for the beatification of a saint by the Catholic Church. Getting back to the story, King Hazael of Aram died, and his son Ben-Hadad succeeded him, and King Joash defeated the Arameans 3 times, as foretold by Elisha, and he recovered the towns which the Arameans had captured. Heading back south to Judah, we pick up the story there after Joash was assassinated. His son Amaziah became king, and once he was firmly established, he rounded up the conspirators who had killed his father and put them all to death. But in an unexpected twist, he allowed their children to live, citing Deuteronomy 24:16 as the basis for his decision. We're then told he was 25 years old when he ascended to the throne and reigned 29 years. Like the other kings of Judah, he pleased Yahweh, but he also didn't remove the shrines, so the people continued to worship and sacrifice outside of Jerusalem. He defeated the Edomites and then challenged Joash of Israel to a battle. The king of Israel warned him against such a battle, but Amaziah didn't listen, and Yahweh's favor didn't help him out much. He lost the battle and was captured by the Israelites. Joash then marched on Jerusalem and breached the walls, creating a gap 400 cubits long before looting the temple and making off with all of the gold and silver, along with the royal treasury and the temple vessels. 15 years later, King Amaziah was also killed by conspirators who were kind enough to allow him to be buried in Jerusalem. His son, Azariah, became king at the age of 16. As for Jeroboam of Israel, he of course displeased Yahweh, but also restored some of their territory according to a promise made to the prophet Jonah. This means that the writings concerning this prophet were already known during the time that this tale was penned. And yes, this is the same Jonah we'll later cover who was gobbled up by a giant fish. At this point, Yahweh decided he'd had enough of the land of Israel and wished to blot out the name of Israel from the entire earth. Their fate was now sealed, and it was only a matter of time before their nation would be destroyed by the Assyrians. Jeroboam reigned 41 years before being succeeded by his son Zechariah. In chapter 15, we return to Judah, where Azariah reigns as king at the age of 16. He ruled 52 years, but since he didn't remove the shrines, Yahweh gave him leprosy for his entire life. So we're told that he pleased Yahweh, but the god also cursed him. I'm sorry, but being cursed by leprosy for 52 years doesn't exactly sound like Yahweh was very pleased with you. But that's all we're told about his life and his reign. Like the others, the rest of his details can be found in the aforementioned source material. Zechariah, despite not being cursed with leprosy, didn't enjoy such a lengthy reign. He only served as king of Israel for 6 months. This is likely because he displeased Yahweh by doing the same things as the southern kings, though we're never actually told what he did. Shallum son of Jabesh conspired against him and murdered the king to take his throne. This fulfills Yahweh's promise in 2 Kings 10:30 to allow Jehu 4 generations of his kin on the throne. Zechariah was the last. Shallum was only king for a month before he was attacked and killed by Menahem. King Menahem went on to capture other territories and killed all the people who refused to surrender, even ripping open the pregnant women. He ruled for a decade and paid tribute to the Assyrians, and his son Pekahiah ruled after him for a couple of years before his aide conspired against him and he was murdered. His aide, Pekah, then became king and ruled the next 20 years and likewise displeased Yahweh. He too died by conspiracy at the hands of Hoshea, the next king of Israel. Back in Judah, Azariah's son Jotham has become king at the age of 25, and he reigns for 16 years. He too displeased Yahweh, but also failed to remove the shrines. We're also told that his mother, Jerusha, was the daughter of Zadok. This is the fictive high priest that's placed into their history to serve as a founder of the priesthood of the First Temple period, meaning that for him to have fathered Jerusha, he'd have to be at least 200 years old, since he was around during the time of David and Solomon. This isn't the first time a character has been inserted into different points in their convoluted chronology. If you recall the book of Judges, there's mention of Phinehas, who appeared in the book of Numbers. In the episode all about the Benjaminites, we calculated his approximate age at around 612. This is what happens when you assemble a multitude of parallel stories into a linear narrative. The only other detail we're given concerning Jotham is the construction of the upper gate of Yahweh's house. The other events of his life are, of course, contained in the annals of the kings of Judah. We're not told exactly what happened to Jotham, only that his son Ahaz succeeded him as king. He was 20 years old and reigned 16 years. Unlike most other kings of Judah, Ahaz is said to have displeased Yahweh. And we learned from the beginning of 2 Kings 16 that he even gave his sons as burnt offerings. This practice of sacrificing your child to Yahweh was no longer proper. This was the old form of worship, not the new. Despite displeasing Yahweh with human sacrifice, he was still able to defeat the kings of Israel and Aram when they besieged Jerusalem. They were, however, able to capture Elath, and the Edomites settled there. In response to the invasion, Ahab sent a bribe to King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria, prompting the Assyrian king to capture Damascus and deport the residents. King Rezin of Aram was captured and executed. After this, Ahaz visited Damascus and saw the altar that Tiglath-Pileser used and sent a sketch of it to Uriah, the priest in Jerusalem. A new altar based on the one in Damascus was constructed, and Yahweh's old altar was tossed outside. The ornaments of the old altar, along with the great basin which was supported by the bronze oxen, were all given to Tiglath-Pileser as a tribute. You might assume that removing and dismantling Yahweh's altar and selling it to the Assyrian king would have angered him, but the god doesn't seem to mind. Chapter 16 of 2 Kings mentions no reaction from the deity at all. After this, Tiglath-Pileser's successor Shalmaneser invaded Israel. King Hoshea had stopped paying his tribute to the Assyrians and attempted an alliance with Egypt, so Shalmaneser besieged Samaria for 3 years before capturing the city and imprisoning the Israelite king. The Israelites were deported to Assyria and settled in various cities there. In chapter 17, verses 8 through 9, we're told that the reason this happened is because they followed Canaanite practices. This is a post-exilic view blaming their past losses on older styles of worship. Later in the chapter, we're told that Yahweh banished them from his presence in Israel, indicating they believed that Yahweh lived in that land and not abroad. Yahweh is still a local god, not a universal one. Then we're told that the Israelites were brought to Assyria, where they still live today. meaning this was writing long after the Assyrian exile, but during a time in which Israelites were still dwelling in that nation. We're also told that the Assyrians brought people from other lands, including Babylon, to settle them in Israel. Moving populations around was common in the ancient world. Emperors did this as a means to prevent rebellion. Later in chapter 17, we're told that Yahweh sent lions to kill the settlers because they didn't worship properly. So the Assyrians sent priests to teach the new residents how to worship. So we have here a reference to Assyrian influence on the Israelite religious practices. Then we find something really curious in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 35 and 36. It references the covenant Yahweh made with Jacob to worship no other gods except for Yahweh because he brought him out of Egypt. Later versions of this text states that Yahweh made this covenant with the people, but if this older version is more accurate, then it means there was once a tradition in which it was Jacob who left Egypt with the Israelites, not Moses. I can't find any other references to this idea, so take it with a grain of salt. It may just be a corruption of the particular version of the Bible where I found it, but it's a cool idea nonetheless. Chapter 17 concludes by saying that, to this day, the people of Israel do as their ancestors did. Chapter 18 gives us the story of Hezekiah's reform. This reform may be a retrojection of later reforms, including that of Josiah. Hezekiah became king at the age of 25 and reigned for 29 years, pleased Yahweh, and finally did something about all those shrines which had been set up during the time of the patriarchs. He closed the shrines, smashed the pillars, cut down the sacred posts. And we're told later in the chapter that these belonged to Yahweh, not some foreign gods. He even destroyed the bronze serpent of the snake god Nehushtan that Moses introduced in the book of Numbers, because the people of Jerusalem were worshiping it. So Numbers tried to give a Yahwistic pedigree to the statue of the snake god, while 2 Kings just describes it as pagan. Neither source even made an attempt to refute the idea that the Israelites were worshiping the snake god. But not Hezekiah. He worshipped only Yahweh. Verse 7 tells us that Yahweh made him successful in everything, including the conflict with the Assyrians. This is obviously a later addition to the text made to fluff up his reputation, as we read later in the chapter that King Sennacherib of Assyria seized all the fortified towns of Judah before Hezekiah promised obedience to the Assyrians. He then gave up all the silver from the house of Yahweh and the treasuries from the palace. Even the gold-plated doorposts from the temple were cut down and handed over to King Sennacherib. Sennacherib then sent other groups of his allies against Jerusalem, and they mocked Hezekiah by offering to give him 2,000 horses if he could find enough soldiers to ride them. They even said that it was Yahweh who had instructed the Assyrians to march against Jerusalem. So Hezekiah, filled with despair, went to the new prophet in town, now that Elisha was gone, a man named Isaiah. Isaiah calmed his fears and informed him that Yahweh would soon deal with the problem by tricking the army and sending them home where their king would be killed. There's a song here that mentions how Yahweh despises the Assyrian king and how Zion is like a fair maiden. Jerusalem is represented by a female deity, which shouldn't be surprising to anyone who listens to this podcast for any length of time. It also mentions how survivors of the house of Judah will escape and regenerate the flock, a clear reference to the returning exiles repopulating the land of Judah after their release from Babylon. During the night, Yahweh came down from heaven and killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, sending King Sennacherib to flee back to Nineveh. While worshiping in the temple there, 2 of his sons killed him and then fled to Ararat. Another of his sons, Esarhaddon, succeeded him as king. While some of this does coincide with history, the story is a bit different. After Hezekiah handed over the riches of Jerusalem to the army wasn't miraculously slain outside the city walls. And while Sennacherib did return to Nineveh, where he was betrayed and murdered, it didn't happen because of anything that transpired in Jerusalem, nor did it happen at that time. Sennacherib collected his ransom and departed Jerusalem. Though he was unable to breach the walls, he claimed victory as he had the sworn loyalty of Hezekiah and buckets of gold to take with him. His army, still intact, went on to conquer multiple cities in the region. In fact, he continued campaigning and expanding his territory for years to come, and his betrayal and death wouldn't occur for another 20 years. In fact, he outlived Hezekiah by a full 6 years, dying on the 20th of October in 681 BCE. In chapter 20, we learned that Hezekiah fell ill, and Isaiah instructed him to get his affairs in order because he was soon going to die. Hezekiah begged Yahweh for a longer life and asked the deity to recall that he was always loyal. So Yahweh approached Isaiah in the courtyard and instructed him to tell Hezekiah to visit the house of Yahweh, and he'll have 15 years added to his life. So on the third day, Hezekiah did as instructed, and Isaiah applied a cake of figs to Hezekiah's rash to heal him. Envoys from Babylon arrived bearing gifts and inquiring about the king's illness. How they heard about the illness in Babylon and managed to send people there in only 3 days is never made clear. Presumably they had internet and cars, but I'm not certain. Hezekiah welcomed them in and showed off his vast wealth. How he had any remaining wealth after recently losing his entire treasury to the Assyrians is likewise not made clear. Isaiah warns against displaying the treasuries to Babylonians because soon they would come to take away all their belongings, including their children, who would serve as eunuchs in the Babylonian palace. This gives us yet another indication that it was written after the time of the exile. At the end of the chapter, we're told that Hezekiah also constructed a tunnel to bring water into Jerusalem during the siege. While such a tunnel certainly exists, it's unclear how much of it was functional during Hezekiah's time. His son Manasseh became king at the age of 12 and reigned 55 years, but he angered Yahweh by building shrines and worshiping all the gods in heaven. So we have another reference to the idea that the biblical authors believed in multiple gods. But Manasseh didn't stop there. He built altars to the other gods in the Jerusalem temple, practiced divination, consulted with ghosts like King Saul had done, sculpted an image of Asherah and placed it in Yahweh's house, which is another reference to Asherah worship in the Jerusalem temple, and finally he sacrificed one of his own sons in fire. But he still wasn't done. He put so many innocent people to death that the city of Jerusalem was filled with blood from one end to the other. This finally convinced Yahweh to completely erase Jerusalem from beneath heaven. But not just yet. Manasseh passed on, and his son Amon became king for 2 years, and of course, he also angered Yahweh. So conspirators killed him, but the people killed the conspirators, and his son Josiah was then made king. Remember earlier when the priests weren't properly spending the money on the temple repairs, so the scribe would be in charge of it? This is where that detail finally comes into play. King Josiah sends his scribes to the temple to weigh the silver so he can pay the workers for those repairs that were being conducted 100 years earlier. When the scribe arrived, High Priest Hilkiah claimed to have found a secret scroll detailing the teaching in the house of Yahweh. The scribe brought it to Josiah, and the never-before-known teachings revealed to him why Yahweh had been so angry with Israel for all these generations. Apparently, everyone in Israel had forgotten where they had come from. They'd forgotten their time in Egypt, the land deal their ancestors had brokered with Yahweh, the promise to worship only that one God instead of all the others, etc., etc. Since they had lost all of their true scriptures, they had all gone astray, but now the proper forms of worship had been rediscovered, so Josiah could institute another reform and get the nation back on track and back into Yahweh's good graces. Of course, this doesn't match up with the idea that Hezekiah instituted these same reforms. I mean, how could he if he didn't know what he was supposed to do? This idea that the current residents didn't know how to properly worship, and so a newly discovered scripture, which claimed to be old, was required to put them on track, doesn't only appear at the end of Second Kings. It's the very concept behind the story of Moses. And even the story of Moses has multiple versions of where he received his teachings and when. It's also what we're told in 4th Ezra, that Persian officials brought the Jewish scriptures to Jerusalem because the newly returned exiles had no scriptures that survived the Babylonian conquest. Some scholars have suggested that the teachings the Israelites received from the Persians were then added to their national history. These scriptures retrojected into older tales like the story of Josiah and Hezekiah and Moses. See episode 38 for an extensive breakdown of this idea. Josiah went to the temple with the elders and read the new scripture and made a new covenant to follow Yahweh and observe his commandments, giving us a nice origin story for the covenant and commandments in the post-exilic period. The temple was once again purged of objects of Baal, Asherah, and all the other gods, and it was all burned in the Kidron Valley. We saw exactly this scene in 1 Kings 15:13 when Asa burned all the idols in the exact same place for the same reason. Another indication that the authors keep placing this event in different points in their history. He also suppressed the worship of the sun, moon, and stars in the Jerusalem temple. This, along with discoveries of the zodiac in Jewish temples, tells us about their long history with astrology. He destroyed the places where the male prostitutes practice in the temple, at the same place where women wove coverings for Asherah. According to the Infancy Gospel of James, weaving in this temple was Mary's job before she became pregnant with Jesus. The chariots of the sun and flaming horses were also removed. This is our sun worship like Helios, which we saw in association with Elijah. Other sites were covered in human bones to serve as the ultimate desecration. These were the sacred posts that have been chopped down about a half dozen times at this point. He also established the practice of the Passover sacrifice, which was prescribed in the New Scroll. You see why some scholars believe that much of the theology of the Old Testament was a later invention? We have here in the post-exilic story the inception of the Passover, which was then retrojected into two other places, Exodus and Joshua. 2 Kings 23:22 actually tells us that the Passover sacrifice had never been conducted before. Necromancers and mediums were outlawed. All this in accordance to Hilkiah's scroll, which served as the introduction for Second Temple monotheism. Later, Pharaoh Necho marched against the Assyrians and engaged Josiah in a battle at Megiddo. Josiah was killed and later buried in Jerusalem. His son Jehoaz was made king for 3 months. He was imprisoned by the Pharaoh and taken to Egypt, where he eventually died, and Eliakim, another son of Josiah, became king, and then changed his name to Jehoiakim. His mother was named Nehushta, after the serpent god in Eden that Moses worshipped in Numbers 22. Jehoiakim paid Egypt a tribute of silver and gold, but he also displeased Yahweh. What was worse, Jehoiakim rebelled against Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar had made Judah a vassal for 3 years before Jehoiakim rebelled. We're told that it was Yahweh who sent the Chaldeans, Arameans, Moabites, and Ammonites against Judah in accordance with the word of the prophets. This is also the time frame mentioned for the birth of Abraham, as he was born in the city of Ur under the Chaldeans, who ruled Ur during this time period. Again, so much of the Old Testament keeps referencing the time period of the Babylonian exile. Despite Judah's repentance, Yahweh punished the land because of the sin of Manasseh. He had filled Jerusalem with the blood of the innocent, so Yahweh would not forgive the city. Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city and captured it, taking away all the treasures and most of its people, carting them off to Babylon. He appointed Jehoiakim's uncle Zedekiah as a puppet king in Judah, but he eventually rebelled against Babylon, so Nebuchadnezzar returned to Jerusalem and besieged it again. Zedekiah was put on trial, his sons were executed before him, and his eyes were put out. Then he was taken in chains to Babylon. Yahweh's house was burned down, as was the palace and all of the homes in Jerusalem. Even the walls were dismantled. The remaining population was also carted off to Babylon, and only the poorest people were left behind to tend the fields. All the precious metals were taken. Army commanders and counselors were put to death. A man named Gedaliah was placed in charge of the few who remained, but he was soon killed by a royal named Ishmael. So the remaining people fled to Egypt to escape. Finally, at the very end of 2 Kings, Evil-Merodach becomes the new king of Babylon. He released Jehoiakim from his prison and enthroned him, and dressed him in fine garments. At this point, I shouldn't have to tell you that this is the scene of resurrection and ascent that we've already encountered several times on this show. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. If you'd like to support the show, there's an Amazon wish list in a pinned post on my Facebook page. The books in that list help with research for future episodes. You can also shop the merchandise from the Zazzle store, which can be found on that same post. Just visit facebook.com/dragonsofgenesis. And you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/dragonsofgenesis. If you have any questions regarding mythology in the Bible, send them to me at dragonsofgenesis@gmail.com, and I'll answer your question in a video on my YouTube channel over at youtube.com/dragonsofgenesis podcast. Don't forget to give a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, and check out the site at dragonsofgenesis.com for links, episode information, and a list of recommended reading. And as always, thank you for listening.